Moderator, it's been a long day and there's still more to come, so I'll try to be as short as possible and restrict myself to a few points. But first, I do need to take this opportunity to thank congregational and presbytery fabric teams for their dedication and in many cases perseverance for looking after church buildings and land, particularly over the last 6 months during the coronavirus pandemic. And then the not inconsiderable challenge of undertaking the risk assessments required before churches could be opened up for worship. A majority of places of worship are either open, albeit in a very strange way. If somebody had told you they would have to book your seat for your Sunday service, well, or they are about to be open. Some will never open. So I hope the General Assembly will join me in thanking them for this quiet, sometimes frustrating, but important ministry. I'd also like to thank the working group, which includes several from the trustees, for providing the guidance for opening up churches. And thanks to our colleagues in COSIS for their support and presbyteries for the hard work in identifying which buildings are opening, reopening, or closing. The data will have wide benefits, including for the Faith Action Plan. It is normal for me at this point to thank retiring trustees and welcome new ones, but much of that was included in the Commission of Assembly earlier. However, I do want to thank the staff of the trustees who, like others, have taken over their kitchen table or their spare bedroom to keep business going and indeed to develop our policy work. It's not been easy, but they have risen to the challenge. And while on staff, I need to say that there has been some changes in our staff with more to come. We were shocked and saddened by the untimely death of one of our Safe Buildings team, Andy Barnett. I know that many people in the church will want to join the trustees in wishing Keith Mason a long and happy retirement after 11 years as our Deputy Secretary. And some of you may have noticed that yesterday was the closing date for applications for our new Chief Executive. David Robertson, our current Secretary, is retiring next year, and we have taken the opportunity to rearrange the work, and we'll have the opportunity to thank David at next year's Assembly. We're also improving our own governance as the trustees move into our centenary year, thus numbers 4 and 5 of our deliverance. Moderator, I want to turn to the major part of our report. Last year, the Assembly agreed that we should consult on our plan for well-equipped spaces in the right places. We were very pleased with the response and wish to thank all those that took part. It has given us a strong base upon which to develop the plan. The deliverances today were prepared for May, and we thought that we should continue to develop the plan in the hope that the Assembly might still back us. Maybe we are asking for forgiveness as well as affirmation. I would like to make 3 points which are at the core of our report and deliverances. All are about the growth of the church as an instrument of God's kingdom. Our land and buildings are important tools to be used, although sometimes it feels that they can get in the way of the building that kingdom. Moderator, you're on record for saying that the last 6 months have challenged our approach to buildings. You have suggested that the Kirk's dependency on church buildings could be permanently broken by the COVID-19 lockdown. Online worship has changed the future. As you have articulated so clearly, our primary concern is for living, breathing Christian communities of today and how these communities are operating in the real world. The General Trustee's response is, what kind of physical resources does the Kirk need to achieve that? So to my 3 points, and they all start with the letter P. The first is actually 2 P's together, pruning and planting. You've heard me say this before, and I will continue to say it. Jesus talks about pruning the vine to bear more fruit. Gardeners know it. We know it has to happen. We have too many buildings, and they are not necessarily in the right place or are the most welcoming. There are some that we all know are within a stone's throw from each other, and none of them full. Is that a sensible use of resources? We spend too much money and time on keeping the estate. In many cases, our buildings are locked in the past, as relevant to the needs of tomorrow's Christian communities as the surgery of Dr. Finlay's casebook is to the modern NHS. But pruning alone is not enough. We need to plant new seeds, but they will not necessarily be the same as the old plants. The new basis for living, breathing Christian communities might be a house, a shop, or effectively a community centre like St Meadows in Perthshire. Or maybe there's our Christian community shares or rents space with others, another denomination or another community group. But let me deal with an issue that's concerning many people. What do we do with the buildings that the Kirk no longer needs? As an architect, I understand why people are emotionally attached to buildings, particularly church buildings. They are the places where rites of passage, baptisms, weddings, funerals, remembrance take place. Many of our buildings are of significance not only to congregations, but to the wider community. They may be listed. The Kirk owns more listed buildings than any other organisation in Scotland. So we can't just ignore them, individually or collectively. While we need to reduce the size of the estate, we have a duty to ensure that these buildings are dealt with sensitively. Some have deteriorated to the point that they have to be demolished, and the land used for redevelopment, perhaps for social housing. Many small buildings can be converted to good homes, but many, both large and small, can make good community facilities, like this B-listed church in Glasgow, now the Pyramid in Anderson, being reborn as a community centre. Do we have to discern a future for some of our main historic buildings, like Brecon Cathedral, where the presbytery plan is to dissolve the congregation, at which point the responsibility for the management passes to the general trustees? We are developing a long-term plan for the cathedral with the presbytery, Historic Environment Scotland, and other authorities to ensure that the building can still meet the interests of the wider community, while allowing the new Brecon congregation to concentrate on developing as a living, breathing Christian community. And we will be helped in this process by the integration with the trustees of the functions of what was Carta. My second P is planning, and a lot has already been said today. The presbyteries are responsible for pruning and planting and making the hard decisions about buildings, not the general trustees. What we can do is to support presbyteries as they make these decisions. Primarily, we believe that without strong and properly professionalised resources, presbytery reform will not work properly. But for COVID, the presbyteries in the northeast and ourselves would have appointed a full-time buildings officer who would support both the planning process and local congregations with the management of their buildings. That pilot is still planned. So what are we doing to support presbyteries in the planning? We've been testing out ideas with a number of presbyteries, including the new Aberdeen and Shetland Presbytery, as it prepared its new plan. The lessons from this are helping to produce the toolkit, which has been much discussed already with Faith Nurture Forum and with the advice from some presbytery clerks, which they will use in making their assessment about land and buildings in relation to the presbytery's mission plan, setting aside their human, financial and digital resources to deliver that mission plan. The first edition of the toolkit, from our perspective, will be available in early November, including advice on minimum standards, location, and managing surplus buildings. More guidance will follow next year. We also want to ensure that future building development is tied to the Presbytery's clear missional plan. And thus we are tightening up the approval process and our grant and loan schemes. We are asking presbyteries to seriously assess the need for the building and the building work. My third P is partnering. I've already mentioned partnering with other denominations and community groups. But how much partnering can we do within the Kirk? We are a Presbyterian church, not a collection of congregational churches. We believe in supporting one another. Some of us have accumulated more wealth than others. Much of this has been inherited from previous pruning and selling off surplus churches and manses, not something we've actually created ourselves. The opportunity, therefore, exists for sharing our good fortune with other congregations with less resources. Can I finish up with one example? St. Rollox is probably the Kirk's most recent building. It had to be relocated to make way for a new road. It was therefore funded through a compulsory purchase order. But that didn't pay for the furnishings. The congregation is a vital one in its locality, perhaps one of the most mixed, living, breathing Christian communities in the city. But when most of your congregation is made up of asylum seekers, you don't have much cash. An appeal within Glasgow Presbytery produced the funds. Thank you to those congregations who are willing to share their good fortune. Is this an inspiration for the future? As I'm not a commissioner, can I ask the Principal Clerk to move the report and deliverance?
I so move.
Seconded.
Thank you. And Raymond, thank you for your report. I don't have any notices to speak at the moment, though there are some amendments as we move through the deliverance. So I think that leaves me free to go straight to the deliverance. Number 1, which is receive the report. Voting is open. I declare that 1 has carried. Come to number 2, and there is amendment in the name of Deborah Nicholl. Deborah, you're there, thank you. Name and number, please, when you're unmuted, and bring to us your proposed amendment.
So Deborah Nicholl, 752. The amendment is to delete the word "a" after "less of" and substitute "an administrative." I believe the convener is happy to accept this, and if so, I don't need to speak further to it.
I am indeed.
Thank you, Deborah, for that. It is seconded. I want to ask Robert Allen if you're speaking to this, Robert, or more generally on 2A. If we could hear from Robert, then we'll know whether to move straight. Robert's just coming.
More generally on number 2, Moderator.
Thank you. Well, stay in place, Robert. We will dispose of the amendment first of all, which has been seconded. Conveners indicated willingness. No other indication to speak on it, so we will put the amendment to the vote. Voting is open. It carries. The amendment carries. So Robert, on 2A now as amended. Thank you.
Robert Allen, 386. Moderator, in welcoming the report, the report does mention about the care of manses, but there is no mention of the old chestnut of moving to mixed manse provision. So, Moderator, a quick word about manses, not a motion for we don't have time, but a word nevertheless to keep the subject of manse provision in the air and on the agenda. As the Church seeks to meet the challenges of our day and enter the 21st century, there is a need to grasp this old nettle. Without going into lengthy detail, can I make one specific short point? For long and weary, we have thrown our hands up in the air and said that mixed manse provision is not possible, for HMRC would then tax the manse as a benefit. Well, I have already seen the regulations that our colleagues in the United Reformed Church use, where some live in manses and others are paid a housing allowance and live in their own house. And the taxman does not seem to be banging at their door. So if the URC can do it, why can't we? Such provision, if chosen, can also lighten the burden on a congregation and actually be financially beneficial to a congregation. So, Moderator, if we're going to be a truly modern church, then let's get this back on our agenda soon, and I would happily play a part in seeing this through to reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Convener, I don't know if you want to respond or you're just taking note.
I would take note of that. I think this is very much an issue for Faith and Nurture Forum in the first instance, but we are always happy to talk with FNF about that kind of thing.
Thank you, Convener. We need to vote then on 2A as amended by Deborah Nicholl's amendment. Voting is live. Vote now, please. (2A) as amended carries. 2B. Voting is live. I think we're beginning to get the hang of this. 2B carries. 2C. And to 2C there's amendment in the name of Jack Stewart. Jack, the team can't find you. Would you raise your hand, please, on Zoom, and we will see you and bring you to the front. Jack, we have you. Would you unmute yourself, please? Give us your name and number and your proposed amendment. Thank you, Jack. We're not hearing you, Jack. Just press unmute, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
That's fine. Okay, right. Okay. Right. Thanks. It's Stuart 279. The convener has suggested to me that, in fact, this amendment is in the wrong place, and that may be the case. But I put it there largely to make a kind of theological point. I'm very impressed by the report, but it does seem to me that it is mainly concerned with buildings as places where things happen, rather than thinking about the importance of the buildings themselves. And it seems to me that if the mission of the church is to promote the kingdom of God on earth, then physical buildings in themselves are very important. I mean, just think of how much diminished our life would be if there were no church or Notre Dame or the Kilmodden Church in Glendaruel. And so my point basically is that we should take really serious note of the spiritual contribution, the spiritual impact, the spiritual message of fine buildings in our community life, and that not necessarily regard everything else as unimportant, but just remember that these are very, very important elements. The shorter catechisms, the chief end of man, or chief end of human beings, is to glorify God. And it seems to me that our buildings should always be built for the glory of God and maintained for the glory of God. And I'm a bit afraid that that important task, that important contribution to the well-being of our society spiritually is in fact tended to be pushed in the back burner, whereas it should be a still very important part of our mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Your amendment has been seconded. I have two requests to speak on this matter. First of all, Monica Redman, followed by Mark McEwen. First of all, Monica.
Monica Redman, moderator. I'm afraid I don't actually know my number, and I'm not sure where on my screen I would look for it.
I think I can
right now. So
announce it. 434.
Thank you so much. I want to speak to resist this amendment. I'm currently sitting in the office of probably the most beautiful church in Scotland, here at St Leonard's, Dunfermline, and yet that is not an important part of the mission of the people of God in Dunfermline. It is a stunning place, and we are very blessed to have it, but we are also a little bit cursed to have something, to have the responsibility for something that that is not of the essence of the faith. I do get the point that we are here to glorify God. I have that tattooed on my arm from the Westminster Confession, so I do understand that. But neither my tattoo nor the building here are of the essence of how we glorify God, and I would resist this. I don't know what we do with buildings like St Leonard's, but they are not the most important thing that we are about these days.
Thank you, Monica. I'll hear now from Mark McEwen and then Andrea Price.
234. Can you hear me, moderator?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Proceed.
Yeah, moderator, it's just a simple point to say that if we accept this amendment, I think it changes the whole logic and indeed goes against the logic of the rest of this section 2C of the deliverance. I point just to one point, the end of point 4, where it says the church's charitable purpose is not the conservation of buildings. And by accepting this amendment, we are in danger of introducing some illogical points into this deliverance. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you, Mark. Andrea?
I hope I've... Yes, Andrea Price, number 17. Moderator, I would support this amendment because another point of the importance of buildings, to my mind, is that often, and especially some of the most beautiful ones, have been built as aids to teaching aids. I minister at St Michael's in Edinburgh, and the more I get to know the building as a relatively new minister there, the more I learn about how much thought has gone into the planning of this building as an outreach into the community and an aid to teach the gospel to people. And I wouldn't say that the building is the most important thing in our toolkit, for sure, but I sure think that we must remember that buildings are important to shelter us, to facilitate community life, to teach the gospel in a comfortable place, and we need to honor that and need to make informed decision and not just abandon all buildings because we think only faith is important. We're not in heaven yet. Sorry.
Thank you, Andrea. Dave Rankin, and then I think we'll be ready to move to vote on Mr. Stewart's amendment. Dave?
I've got a lot of sympathy with what Mr. Stewart's saying, but I'm not sure that we can sign up to these because architectural distinction and beauty are not really objective terms, and what I think is beautiful or of distinction is not what someone else might think. If it was something like function, or that we had a responsibility that our buildings were useful, I could understand that, but I would resist it because it's quite subjective.
Thank you, Dave. There's a request to speak on 2A, but I'm sorry, 2A is passed. It was amended and it is carried. So there's nothing else on Mr. Stewart's amendment. I'm going to give him the opportunity. He may not want to, but give him the opportunity to say another word or two after hearing the debate, and then I will ask Raymond to close the debate. Mr. Stewart, again.
Obviously, what we regard as beautiful is subjective to a sense, although you could spend another, days and days arguing whether that's the case. But it does seem to me that subjective feelings are absolutely vital to the quality of life that we enjoy. Some people could argue that Christian values are in fact simply subjective. So the fact that it's subjective doesn't seem to me to rule out the importance of the value of beautiful buildings to our spiritual life. Just like, one of the most spiritual experiences I've ever had is visiting Chartres Cathedral. And that still, in fact, is something that has stuck in not only my mind, but in my soul. And without places like that, our life would be deeply impoverished. So I'm not suggesting that this is the only or even the most important part. I'm simply saying that we should remember that the creation and the maintenance of beautiful things is a very important part of our life in this world.
Thank you, Jack. Convener, to close.
Moderator, thank you. I would like to thank Jack for his contribution. And I'm afraid I'm going to ask the Assembly to resist it, but I want to just make 3 points. First of all, he himself said at the beginning that we'd had a conversation when we suggested it was in the wrong place. The problem is that what we've got in the deliverance is simply the first line of what this bit was about. And if I can quickly read on, what it says is, the traditional model which the church operates, that of providing space for church presence through a dedicated building, is not appropriate in every case. A range of models is more appropriate. There are alternative ways of the church having a space or presence in the community which do not involve ownership of buildings. And that was what that was intended to be. And in fact, it's the second part. If we'd put into the deliverance the full wording, then that would have been seen. The second thing is, yes, I agree, and I'm an architect, so I am inspired by buildings, and I think they can inspire mission, but the building should not be the driving force in mission. We have made the point in paragraph 2.9 of our report that there should be no sacred cows. That the church has to face up to the fact that there are going to be buildings, and Brecon Cathedral was one of them, which I've mentioned, which may have to go. The question is, how do we deal with it? And so I've sympathy for the idea that we should have good buildings. The third point I want to make is there is a new section later coming up in the name of Deborah Nicol, which I intend to accept, and it's about architectural quality. And I think that covers very much the point which Jack was hoping that we might say. So I'm asking the Assembly to resist this amendment.
Thank you, Convener, and I'm sure Deborah heard what you said about her proposal. So the Convener is minded to resist. We have an amendment before us in the name of Jack Stewart. It was seconded. We've discussed it. You might vote for it now. The voting is open on Mr. Stewart's amendment. The vote is closed. There were 91 for it and 352 against it. And so 2C in the original just waiting on 2C to come before you. Would appear to be live now. Click current live debate if you need to refresh, and we can vote on it. 2C as in the print. I'm not sure if the voting system is stalled. Oh no, more votes coming in now. I think we've had the vote open long enough. 2C carries. We move to 2D. D is open to vote. It carries. And we come to 2E, which we will take as it is, and then we will have a new 2F in the name of Andrew Nisbet and a new 3 in the name of Deborah Nicholl. So 2E as in the print. The vote is open. I declare it to be carried, and so what will become a new 2F, a new section being proposed by Mr. Andrew Nisbet. Andrew, name and number, please, when you are unmuted, and then please address the Assembly.
Andrew Nisbet, number 362. Moderator, the approval of the Radical Action Plan at last year's General Assembly signalled fundamental change at all levels of the Church of Scotland, from the General Assembly councils and committees, through presbyteries and on to the local congregations, and in some places causing shockwaves. I do not dispute that part of the change will be a significant reduction in the number of church buildings and congregations across Scotland, and I do accept the points made in this and other reports that doing nothing is a recipe for slow decline, and indeed our future depends on a radical shift in the way in which local church is organised, resourced and funded.
Mr. Nisbet, the convener has indicated he will accept this. I don't want to cut you off entirely in your prime, but it may allow you to reduce a little what you want to bring to the Assembly in the knowledge that the convener is minded to accept.
Yes, okay, I'll abbreviate it somewhat. I am encouraged that the appointment of the new Chief Officer recognises the need for strong change management. And it's clear from the number of the reports today that this is now happening and the pace of change is accelerating. If I move on to perhaps the sort of fundamental bits, I mean, there are toolkits being suggested, and that's all very good and well. But from a business perspective, that seems good. It's planned, it's organized, except my big concern is continuing the business theme. Where are the customers in all of this? Our congregations are not ordinary customers. Many of our congregation members have invested considerable amounts of time, energy, and skills into their local churches. They must have a say in this. And we are going through a radical change, but it mustn't be just a top-down exercise that alienates many of our members. And to prevent that happening, I think presbyteries need to support congregations through their own change management process. There's already guidance on the church website if you search for managing change, and that has a brief document there that identifies a process for the journey with people through change. And that's really what I'm trying to get at, is that, and this motion is getting at, is we need to take people along. Even if their church closes, they need to have felt that there is a real engagement in that decision and not something that is handed down on high. So I would support everyone to support the motion.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
I do
Nisbet.
have a seconder, the Reverend Christine Murdoch, number 336.
Thank you. If Christine could press second, then we can move on. Or another person. It is seconded. I have no notes for anyone to discuss. Convener has indicated he is willing to accept it. Do you want to say something, Raymond?
Yes, could I just add, thank Mr. Nisbet for this motion. Part of the toolkit will in fact be about how do we get congregations involved in the process. And I think absolutely correctly, we need to actually work on a bottom-up approach and not a top-down approach, and therefore encourage congregations to work out their own future, but they need help from presbyteries to do that. And I'm grateful to him for this motion.
Thank you. And so the Assembly needs to decide if it wants to accept Mr. Nisbet's new section, which will become, in effect, 2F. The voting is open. Thank you. That carries. Thank you, Mr. Nisbet. Now we have what will become a new 3, renumbering obviously in time, in the name of Deborah Nichol. Deborah, again, I think you heard earlier the convener saying he was minded to accept it. You may want to just introduce your new section.
Thank you, Moderator. 752 Deborah Nichol. So the proposal is to urge the General Trustees to encourage architectural quality of both the sanctuary and church exterior within the well-equipped spaces in the Right Places plan and report their progress to the next General Assembly. Lockdown has taught us that we can worship anywhere, but that implies that the church building is primarily for the regular attender. If we look to history and why the early church started building church buildings in the first place, it was for the skeptical, for the unconvinced, for the Christmas comers, and then only secondly for the regular. The building is a part of our testimony to society. And I think we do need to be asking ourselves, how can we convey a fraction of God's glory before anyone needs to say a word? Design is not a luxury, and it's one of the strongest communication tools we have. It will benefit mission and it will benefit discipleship. And I believe that our church needs that today more than ever. This motion doesn't say how that architecture, it's not saying that it is the traditional building and that we must hold to that. It's just asking us to consider what we need. And this comes from a point of academic research and on the ground interviews with people who have explained the difference that being in a church building can have and how that can help them connect to God. And I think that's something that, as part of the practical focus that we have, we should also be mindful of. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. We always welcome well-informed motions to the Assembly. It is seconded. The convener isn't going to oppose it. You want to say something,
I
Raymond?
want to encourage this. This fits very well with the agreement earlier today that the functions of Carter should come to us. And it helps us to remind ourselves about quality. And so I'm very pleased to accept it. And I may say, in my conversations with Miss Nicholl, I gather she has done quite a bit of study on churches, and so I've asked for a copy of her report, and she's in fact sent it to me now, and I will look forward to reading it.
Excellent, thank you. So we vote on this new section in the name of Deborah Nicholl. The voting is open. Vote now, please. I declare it to carry. This becomes the new 3. Thank you, Deborah. And now back to the print, the original 3. No notices of anyone requesting to speak. I'll just let folks get the screens back where they need to be, that we might move towards voting on 3 as it was. We'll have that live to vote as soon as we're ready. It's open. Please vote now on 3 as in the print. Three is carried. We move to 4. Again, no notice of request to speak. Open the voting, please, on 4. Four carries. We move to 5. Open the voting, please. It's carried. 6. Voting is open. Six is carried. Number 7. Voting is open. Seven is carried. Number 8. Voting open. It is carried. I think we move to the deliverance as a whole. I lost my numbers there. The deliverance as a whole, please vote now. And it carries. Thank you. Raymond, thank you for your report, for dealing with the discussion this afternoon. We understand that these last months will not have been easy for the General Trustees, as for anyone. So we thank you for the tremendous work that goes on and as it carries into the days to come. Thank you very much.